Okay, thank you very much, Stefan, and I'd like to thank all the organizers, you and Konstantin and Pavlos, for the opportunity to give this talk. And I will take a more somewhat provocative stance instead of presenting uh, results like the impressive talk that uh, Preslov gave earlier. I will try to make some reflections and think about what's exactly the problem statement we should be looking at, and make some considerations about how that reflects in knowledge graphs and knowledge representation. So before I go on, I'd just like to highlight this chart here, this cartoon, which I think reflects at least some aspects of the problems that we are dealing with. And I thought it's kind of funny. So this is a summary of can you see? I'm not sure if you see exactly what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, it actually looks a bit blurred on my end. I see parts of the title slide and parts of the news slide. Actually, not sure if I'm the only one.
Yeah.
No, same here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let me try. Oh, there you
Yeah,
go.
that's better.
Better.
That's
There
better.
seems some delay there. So to summarize, what I propose to do is, first of all, this phenomena that we're looking at, which I now am calling, not me actually, I'm borrowing the term information disorder that Claire Wardle, which has been cited already, to collectively refer to these phenomena of communication, misinformation, and so on. And I try to take a look at other disciplines rather than computer science, what they are looking at, how they are looking at the problem, and try to come up with a problem statement which is in some sense more consistent with these points of view, tries to encompass all these aspects. And then I will, as I said, make some considerations on what kind of consequences this has or challenges this poses for knowledge graphs, which is another part or an important part of the topic of this workshop. So rather than come up with solutions, I would really want to raise some questions and challenges that we could look at. Okay, let's see. So yeah, I apologize for the delay in coming up with the update here. I don't know where is the failure in renewing the screen. I hope this eventually gets updated correctly. Let me see if I. Yeah. So first is this definition of misinformation and disinformation, and the whole idea of misinformation or information disorder, more generally speaking. Initially, there was this definition that has already been mentioned here about some inaccuracy in communication. People communicating inaccurate information unknowingly, unintentional, but there's a notion of inaccuracy. Nyhan and Reifler have tried to be a bit more precise about that, characterizing it as spreading people's or people having beliefs about factual matters which are not supported by clear evidence and expert opinion. So the idea that there is evidence and experts, and these experts have some sort of consensus about these factual matters, and that's considered to be true. And if people disagree with that or spread information that is not consistent with that, that's misinformation. And recognizing the fact that in some areas, it's like politics, often there isn't such a consensus, and that's not even clear who are the experts. Garrett et al., they changed the definition a little bit to the fact of being inconsistent with the best available evidence, which also takes into account that this check is done at a certain point in time with available information, and it's dynamic over time, right? And when we go to disinformation, like others have pointed out, the big difference is the presence of intent. There is some intent, usually political gain or profit, or discredit some target individual, group of movement, or political party. So in the case of disinformation, there is a clear intent. So to this, I will add additional phenomena, which I think also fall under this category, that I'll call them information disorder plus. First, already has been mentioned too about conspiracy theories, which basically is the idea that some groups try to explain a set of facts or events as being part of some secret plot by other actors to achieve a certain goal, right? So it's giving a certain interpretation to certain facts in a particular way to explain some theory about actors in the world. And often there is no relation in terms of accuracy or consensus about these facts and the theory that they're proposing, right? Then there's propaganda, which I'm not going to elaborate more because it has been already very well presented by the previous speakers in the morning. But also, it's clear that propaganda shares a number of characteristics and can be considered a kind of information disorder, at least the kind of phenomena that we want to look at. And there's another one which is less talked about. I haven't seen anybody here talk about it yet, which is a phenomenon called gaslighting. I don't know how many of you know the term, but it's the idea that some agent will systematically undermine some other agent's beliefs in such a way that the second agent starts doubting his or her own capacity to evaluate facts. So it's like they're creating this illusion of reality that, in some sense, the subject of gaslighting loses the agency to independently evaluate certain facts and situations. And there are many, for example, there are many scholars that claim that, for example, what Trump and his followers have been doing is a collective phenomenon of gaslighting, right? Creating this completely parallel reality such a way that many people end up in some sense, giving up their agency in evaluating the truthfulness or accuracy of what is being claimed. Now, what's common about these phenomena is that there is, perhaps with less so with propaganda, is that they assume that there is a notion of truth. So when you talk about veracity or inaccurate facts, implicitly you're saying, well, there is some measure against which you can determine whether something is accurate or true. Now, the situation is not as clear-cut as one would like. And I like very much this scheme of things that Emily Fraga and Leticia both proposed to characterize the universe of misinformation. And this sort of a pyramid where the size here tends to represent the amount of facts that fall under each category. So at the top, we can say, I'm sorry, there are two dimensions that determine the classification here in this hierarchy. One is the existence of expert criteria and the level, so the level of consensus, the defined expertise. So who is an expert, how the bias can be determined, right? On the other side, you have criteria for evidence. So there exists clear the amount of evidence, how it's observable, how universal it is. So these are criteria that can be applied. And there is a relatively small number of facts or claims, let's call it that way, that fall under this category, that there are clearly identified experts, consensus about it. There are clear criteria to evaluate the truthfulness. And it's a relatively straightforward matter of determined agreement. So if you take those as being the true, the truth, then it's relatively easy to check against them. And that's the case that when we use, for example, fact databases and so on, that somehow represent this settled truth. Then there is a larger set of facts which don't have these criteria well defined. One can say that they're emerging. So there's a partial set of criteria to determine who are the experts and whether they agree or not, and how to evaluate the evidence that is given. And the vast majority, perhaps, are facts which none of these criteria in either side exist or have any agreement. And those are the controversial ones. And these typically fall in areas like politics, where a lot of the claims have more to do with subjective perception than objective facts, right? And somehow we have to distinguish in which part of this continuum we are working with. And I would like to think of an approach where we can encompass all of them if possible. Now, looking at the aspect of consuming information, refresh my screen here. There are a number of what I would call pitfalls, like phenomena that happen when people consume information. Things like, for instance, when people are confronted with facts that contain that refer to values that personal values that they hold, and these claims referring to these personal values contradict. They present evidence that contradict the personal values. Well, people tend to discard that, or at least give less credence to these claims than to those that are more consistent with their personal values. And generally, this is really another kind of bias, which people have already mentioned, that it's pretty well known. The fact that we tend to agree more and find recognize more facts that agree with what we already think. So we tend to prefer things that somehow are consistent with what we already believe, and that, in a way, confirms what we already believe, right? And on the other side is what people prefer to do when they are faced with claims that produce some sort of cognitive dissonance. They are in disagreement with whatever perceptions they have or preferences. Some people will simply ignore it. Some people will tend to minimize it. So that introduces a difference in the way people consume information. There's also a subset of people that have a higher predisposition towards conspiracy theories. This has also been established in studies that, for example, people that have a very, they regard self-reliance very highly, tend to, there's a positive correlation with that and acceptance of conspiracy theories. People who follow, no, do your own check, look for yourself, and don't regard what other people are saying or arguing about these claims. Then there's also, when we consume information, we typically work with heuristics to minimize the effort in consuming information. So reaching some sort of evaluation about the truthfulness of facts based on some heuristics. For example, I know that if I read in the newspaper an opinion column or a section of the newspaper, I should not interpret whatever is being said that as a claim about truthfulness, but rather an opinion that is being made by some author. And that might not be the case if I see that in some political news section. So the sections are used as a heuristic to help me in quickly identifying my evaluation of a certain information piece. Now, what happens often is that in social media, these heuristics are not there, or they can even be manipulated, right? Like catching a certain brand or giving the perception of a certain context which is not true, and that can lead to inappropriate heuristics or that will affect the way I consume that information. There was a paper a couple of years back by Dan Cahan in which he showed that people, it has to do with the first point that I already mentioned, that people will not only give preference to things which are consistent with personal values, but they will actually adapt their reasoning to be consistent with that, which is called motivated reasoning, right? And there was articles that say, oh no, there was one article that says why politics makes us stupid, something like that, which shows that people will actually negate evidence, not because they can't reason. It's been first established that they have the ability to reason, but because it contradicts their fundamental values, they just change the way they reason. But more recent research has shown that this is actually not really true. This doesn't happen. So the evidence shows that if people engage in reasoning at a deep enough level, they will typically evaluate the truthfulness appropriately when given a set of claims. But the point is that the premise about the appropriately analyzing the information, most people will just not do that. They will not engage in that kind of deep reasoning, or they're incapable of doing that for some cognitive reason. So what has been shown is that if they engage, this effect doesn't really exist. It's more that media should, in some way, facilitate this level of deeper reasoning, right? And finally, another pitfall is that people tend to think that there is consensus about certain topics when there isn't really, especially if they agree with what they think. So it's the sort of thing everybody thinks about, agrees about this. Well, this is the opinion of everybody when it's actually not the case. And of course, this is also a way that another way that it can be manipulated, giving the false perception, like using bots, that people will think that that's the perception of the majority of people when it's not. So now let's try to understand in a more algorithmic way what is going on, right? So let's assume that there is an agent, and the agent will want to take an action. And to do that action, he or she will need a set of facts. Facts would be just claims in which that agent somehow is willing to use. So I would say it trusts those facts to be true, right? So now there is a new claim that comes in. So the agent must evaluate, am I going to use this or not to take the action that I want to take, right? So it will first look in its trusted knowledge graph to see if that fact is already there. Either it's there or it's implied by something that's there. If it's there, fine. It can use that. It doesn't really have to do anything because it's already known and trusted. Now, often we find is that, no, it's not there. And the agent has to decide, well, will I trust it or not? And then there's a number of criteria to do that. But one typical thing that is done is I say, well, okay, give me additional evidence. For example, who said this? Or give me supporting evidence that will, if it's true, then claim A will also be true, right? And the general case, you just don't ask for one, but a certain number. And the number of such supporting evidence varies according to context and according to the action and who the agent is, right? So in the general case, what happens is that, of course, I forgot to mention that when you get claim B, this process repeats itself, right? The agent has to decide, do I accept claim B or do I need additional information? So this ends up forming a trust lattice, or each path in this lattice is like a chain, a trust chain. But obviously, this chain has to stop somewhere. At one point, I will get to a claim, which are the leaves in this lattice, which are you have to accept regardless of additional information. That can be because there isn't additional information. That can be because the agent decided that that's the case for some arbitrary reason. In fact, I would claim that these anchors in these chains are beliefs, what is commonly known as beliefs, what people believe in. And it's interestingly, I found that there's already some pretty advanced research in trying to relate what is a belief to activity in the brain. And there's some evidence that what happens is there is an interaction between perception. You get a stimulus. You have some sort of way to attribute a value to that perception. And those two things ultimately will determine what actions you will do. In determining the action, you will also take into account what you want to achieve. So it's some sort of prediction and some sort of evaluation of reward and cost to do that. But this whole process happens in the brain very, very fast in a not very clear way. And obviously, they can't measure exactly that. But what they have been able to measure is that the areas in the brain that are activated when the people receive a certain information, if you look at people that share beliefs, the same areas are activated, and these areas are different than people who share a different set of beliefs, given the same information. So there's some notion, there's some basis that we can speculate that beliefs are a fundamental component that we act on, that can explain why and how we act, right? So typically when you get an information, you will, well, I know about this. You can say, I have observed it, I have seen it, I have heard it firsthand, so I know it's true. And I believe in myself, kind of thing, which is exactly the kind of thing that gaslighting tries to undermine, right? But we know this is actually not very reliable. For example, I don't know how many of you know the phenomena of selective attention and this gorilla experiment, where the experiment goes as this. People are shown a video of people with a basketball, and they asked to count the number of passes between people as they bounce the ball around. Now, in the course of these people throwing the ball, there is a gorilla that walks in the scene. I'm showing here a frame of the video. The gorilla comes in very slowly and explicitly, and he goes away. Then after that, the experimenter asks the people how many passes there were. People say 10, 15, whatever. And then he asks, did you see the gorilla? And most people don't see. They don't even see that. And this has been experimentally shown. So that means that our own perception is fooled a lot of times. So it's not that reliable. And we know this also for example, witnesses or facts, or you can do this experiment yourself. When you watch a film, there's often what they call continuity mistakes, like somebody is wearing a scarf in one scene, and the next take, for example, showing the person sideways in front, and the person doesn't have a scarf or is using a different kind of shirt. And for most people, you don't even notice it because you're not paying attention to those details. You're paying attention to a more different aspect of the problem, right? And now, currently, there's another phenomenon that we are observing, which are the deepfakes, right? So deepfakes can also fool one's perception, not only with images, but sound too. We know that we can currently, with the technology, allows you to synthesize the voice and the exact speech manner of any actor to say whatever you want. And it's virtually undetectable. So when we now hear somebody saying something, it's not so obvious that you should trust that, even though you're hearing it and you say, that is that person saying it. Okay. Another reason that we accept certain beliefs is through what's called epistemic deference. So to external authorities, like social norms, religious norms, and moral norms. So one example of social norm is your birth date. Who determines what is your real or your accepted true birth date? Typically, there is some registration authority that will, by agreement, I'm sorry. Okay, so there is, by convention, we assign the public faith notion to some authority that says whatever that authority says about this subject is true. So you take that, you don't question that, or you don't need additional information when you get the information from that source. So what do we mean then when we're talking about countering information disorder, right? So what is the desired effect in the end? That's the question. My take on this is that ultimately we want to change people's behavior, right? And that's also what has been already pointed out in by previous speakers in terms of saying, well, you want to change people's attitudes towards a certain subject. Whether that's legitimate or not, it's a matter for debate. So like when we're talking about the good propaganda, you want people to vaccinate themselves collectively through some mechanisms. We have agreed that that's a good thing to do, a number of reasons, and you want to convince people who may be hesitant that they should vaccinate themselves. So that's the action you want to make people take, right? In order to do that, often you have to replace their mental models with some other suitable mental model. So you present alternative narratives that will be more acceptable to them, right? And in doing so, typically, there's a process of correction. When you're saying about countering, we can say you're trying to correct some disinformation, or even propaganda, right? And there are a number of dimensions about corrections, like in terms of how effective or what's most effective, right? For example, you can do direct rebuttal, or you can present alternative facts which are related that somehow undermine or diminish the credibility or the acceptance of the original claim. And there's some research that shows that, especially for people who have strong beliefs on certain subjects, if you just go and you simply deny or you contradict that directly, their reaction is typically to entrench and reinforce their belief in those facts and diminish the belief of the alternative narrative, right? So sometimes you need a subtler approach in which you show something related to that indirectly weakens the credibility of the original narrative, right? The other question is, how much should you do it? Should you do it once? Should you do it repeatedly? There's also a question whether how detailed should this correction or rebuttal be, right? Because there are studies that show that frequency is a very important thing. So some people said, no, you shouldn't do it because you're reinforcing the original false narrative, or let's call it the one that you're countering. But it's been also shown that no, this doesn't really happen, that you should repeatedly provide that. Also, there is this question about, sometimes people say, if you give too detailed an explanation, people will tend to prefer the simpler one, even if it's not supported by facts, simply because for cognitive reasons, it's easier to believe simpler explanations, right? The other aspect is, when should you do it? Should you preemptively do it? Should you do it together with when this is especially true for social networks, when some communication or some narrative is given, you simultaneously show some counter narrative to sort of lessen the credibility of the original one? Or should you do that post facto, afterwards, right? So there's also some research that shows that the most effective one apparently is to do it afterwards and repeatedly, right? But what's also been shown, and this is to do with the original question, what do we want to achieve, is the fact that yes, all of these techniques will change the perception of people about the truthfulness of the original narrative. but that doesn't change their beliefs, right? So, and ultimately doesn't necessarily change their actions. So we need to look into additional actions. It's not just, in some sense, discrediting or reducing the believability or the acceptance of these facts. We have to reach the belief level, right? So I've already mentioned some side effects that happen in this process. So the backfire effect, which has been disputed whether it actually exists or not. There are recent results saying these hypotheses are really not borne by observational studies. Things like what I mentioned, if you give a too detailed an explanation, it will people will prefer the simpler one, or the fact that people will prefer narratives that are more consistent with their personal values, and also one that has been proposed, the fact that if let's call them false, or one narrative is repeatedly given, people will just be more familiar with it, and we have a tendency to take things that we're more familiar with as being true. So repetition plays a role here, and this has not been actually borne by the latest studies, right? Another side effect is that by exclusion, people will tend. This has been observed that given the fact that you can't fact check or verify everything, people tend to assume that if you don't do any kind of rebuttal or correction, then that thing is something that hasn't been subject to that is by default true. So people tend to accept things as more true if they haven't been rebutted or contradicted. And in the extreme, there's a spillover effect that people simply get fed up and say, well, this whole thing, everything is false. We don't believe anything. You can't rely on that, which is also not good, because that prevents good information or achieving what society considers good effects to be transmitted as well, right? And this has already been touched upon, the fact that fact checks are nothing more than narratives of their own. They may be structured or based on certain principles, but they're nothing more than additional narratives. And this is especially the case when you're dealing with objective facts, right? So there are objective facts which are more easily to fact check and counter in terms of truthfulness. But in other cases, they reflect opinions. And this has already been noticed and actually talked about in the media, because in many cases, fact checkers themselves are just doing the fact check to express their own opinions. Like this one about the Washington Post fact check, or this other one here also about the same fact checker. And there's sometimes a more nuanced also stance or narrative, like this one where...
So Daniel, just to interrupt very briefly, even though I hate to do that because it's interesting to listen to your presentation, we have 8 minutes left, including questions. So if you want to leave a bit of time for questions, it would be good if you could wrap up slowly.
Okay, so... Okay, so Another point I'd like to make, which addresses what has already been pointed out, that one solution is about digital literacy. There is some research that shows that maybe it can work in some homogeneous societies, but in general, it's not the case. Here I'm giving an example of digitally literate groups like the QAnon that are able to produce very structured and well-formed narratives about their points of view about the world that obviously translate their own views about events. And you cannot just say, oh, these people are not digitally literate. They are literate, but they're using that for their own purposes. All right. So the whole point is that ultimately this is not about truth. It's about the dispute of narratives. You have alternative narratives which are being offered to users, and they must choose about those. Right. I'm going to skip this, which is just a characterization of the trust process that happens when an agent receives information. I'll quickly go over this definition of trust because it's the basis of a lot of the process that we are talking about, which is I define as being knowledge-based reliance on received information. So ultimately, they are anchored in belief. It's a trust process. And the important point that truth is actually binary, because you cannot half trust and you cannot half act. I know a lot of you will immediately say, no, but I can have a shade of truth, degree of trust in some fact or some agent. And there I point out the fact that we should not confuse a model of trust, which is what I'm just talking about, and a trust model, which is a way to measure trustworthiness. And there's many ways that you can do that. And ultimately, you can take trustworthiness, but you must convert that into a binary value when you want to act, because you have to decide whether you're going to use that information or not, right? Just to finish up, I'd like to give an example of what I would like to be able to support in terms of analysis of the phenomena that we are discussing. There's a very recent study that came out that shows that people that stormed the Capitol, the majority of the people, this is based on interviews and analysis of court records of people being prosecuted for the invasion, 377 people. The majority of them say they acted under the stimulus of Trump. They were not doing it for other vandalism or trespassing purposes. And the core value that they were worried about was called the Great Replacement. In other words, minority gaining over them in terms of rights. So Hispanics and blacks are displacing the place of whites in society. And that was a uniform factor that was observed in 3 different studies. I have the reference here. You can go look at it in a lot of detail, right? So if we were to represent this schematically, this is how I would propose to do it. Let me see if I go back and forward. Yeah, I know you can't see everything, but the idea here is that on one hand, you have Trump tweeting that there was a massive electoral fraud. Trump also tweeted that, well, we should make America again. It's not just sweet, but I'm simplifying it. And implicitly, that relates to a personal value that whites have more rights than blacks and Hispanics. That's the white supremacy ideology, right? On the other hand, you have Joe Biden, which will follow. He's a Democrat, and he will implement democratic values, and these values imply that whites, black, and Hispanics have equal rights. So I would like to somehow make those relations evident and clear in analyzing claims, so that people that consume, they can analyze and choose. You may not convince people about this because changing the fundamental values is complicated, but at least it's evident what is going on, right? Okay, I'm not gonna, there's another one which you'll get a copy in the slides, which I explained the same thing about this notion of vaccines and people talking about vaccines being the mark of the beast and so on, which actually can be shown to dovetail with the other value-based argument that I was giving before. So just to conclude, for knowledge graphs, I think the important part is that instead of thinking of knowledge graph as containing truth, it should contain claims, as already been pointed out. In other words, you have to introduce the notion of point of view. Everything there is a point of view of some agent, right? And if you want to do that, I would postulate that node and link level representations are too low level. Your node should be something like nano publications. And provenance here is a key. Nano publications include provenance. You can argue, some people have argued that you could use a Wikidata data model, which is true. However, one very weak spot in the Wikidata data model, which has been used for a lot of people for doing fact checking, is that there's no authorship information as Wikidata. It's in the Wikibase, but not there, right? And another challenge that we have is to properly extract attribution. So another challenge is to extract fine-grained argumentation relations. I think we'll have a talk later on in the session about this, which I think is very interesting. And ultimately, I would like to see how can we somehow incorporate human values into knowledge graphs to make all of this reasoning factable. Okay, thank you. Sorry to rush through the end. This is it. I don't know if we'll have time for questions, but we can also use the discussion session afterwards to that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Daniel, for that inspiring presentation. Do we have questions? So, I mean, as we said, there's not too much time, but I think we certainly could squeeze in one or two questions. So, as usual, Konstantin.
Yes, sorry, I see Joanna's hand is raised.
Okay, you want to go ahead, Joanna?
You are muted.
Sorry, yes, I was saying that I had no question and maybe I just forgot my hand raised. I'm apologies for that. Great talk anyway. Now that I have to speak, I'll speak.
Okay, Konstantin, if you spot something, just alert me. Otherwise, I would go ahead with one question. So, I mean, looking at the morning session and looking at your talk, my feeling is in the morning we have been looking a lot at the challenge of how to provide and detect accurate information, right? So how to detect misinformation, propaganda, and feed that into systems which could help in providing better information to the user. Your talk had a bit of that, but it also was looking a bit into the other side of the picture. So how do we get people to actually consume correct information and really digest it? So how to avoid all these cognitive biases which humans usually expose. And I mean, your talk made me a bit thinking that maybe the latter part is actually even the harder challenge, right? Because I mean, you always have people looking for the wrong kind of sources and jumping on the wrong kind of information on purpose, right? So I mean, and I suppose to some extent, whatever kind of information you would provide to some people, they may always end up with looking at the kind of stuff which is less accurate and less trustworthy. And I was wondering, have you been looking in your own research on this second part, which probably delves a bit into psychology, cognitive psychology, nudging, and all these kind of topics on how to actually get people to consume the right kind of information, if there is such a thing?
Well, so I haven't been directly researching yet because I've been learning about it by reading up on all of these different areas where some of the studies that I showed have already conducted large-scale experiments, because a lot of this is really experimental, involving a number of studies with people and so on. And but what I would like to be able to do is to tie those things with representation and knowledge graphs so that we can support. I don't think we will deal with these things directly, because I don't see that as really the role of either databases or knowledge graphs, but we can better support and help in the usage and in detecting, for example, propagandistic discourse, and represent what's the rhetorical. Yeah, that's one of my references. I just saw what Johanna said about Lakoff. He's one of my inspirations on this. That ultimately, I think we have to adopt this notion that there is no truth, really. No matter what we feel, how strongly we feel, there's always a group of people who will look at a certain narrative and be willing to act on that, regardless of evidence and whatnot. And I don't know if we can change that, but at least we can make it more explicit what is the underlying structure of being reasoned and so on. And I think ultimately we can relate that to personal values. So when we talk about bias, and Pressler was talking about different media biases and so on, I think the bias should be related to how these media deal with specific values, not so much as a left, right, and so on, but rather, do you believe in the right of life, and that translates whether you're pro or against abortion, or the right to education, and the priorities. That's what Lakoff says, right? What is more important? So that's the direction I would like to move into.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot, Daniel. So there is a bit of activity in the chat, which I can see. So I encourage everyone to have a look at that. And I do hope that we are going to find some time later on to continue the discussion somehow. For the time being, I would be happy to hand over to Pavlos, who is going to chair the next paper presentation. So
let me just add
yeah, Daniel?
one remark. I will add, I will send a copy of the slides. I just have to finish up inserting some of the references, because I'd like to make it a bit more complete for reference. So I just put names, but I would like to make the reference in the slide so that anyone who reads it can follow through.